Well, thanks for having me. What we're going to try to do in 45 minutes or something is talk about what's going on in the U.S. economy, and then we'll have 10 minutes for y'all to ask questions. So some of this we'll go through pretty quickly. It's hard to cover the entire U.S. economy in 50 minutes, but we will try to do that. If in the middle of it you got a question, raise your hand and just stop. And if we run out of time at the end, we run out of time at the end. That's okay. I've been instructed not to keep you long because you're hungry and everybody's got to get something to eat before their 12:30 class. One thing that is interesting, and I'm going to tell you this, and y'all know this better than I do. Be careful about what you ever put out on the internet. And I'm not saying that from your parent's standpoint. Dr. Williams was just nice enough to read this curriculum vitae or whatever you want to call it. And that came off the internet somewhere. That is about 4 of them ago. We keep trying to cut it down and make it short and sweet. And I'm not picking at all. But these things get out there and they won't disappear. You know, and you get out there and he's saying these things and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, he's got the long one, which is what he has. So so just be careful because nothing ever disappears out there on you, which is kind of interesting. All right, so what we're going to talk about a little bit is competing in the global economy. And the keyboard that I need to use, the clicker doesn't work, so I need to advance the slides. All right, Albert Einstein said if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. I know from the first class I taught this morning, I probably got a little deep into what was going on. Some people took a nap. So we're not going to do that. We're going to talk more about trends. We're going to talk about what's going on. We're going to try to keep it high level so that we can all stay on the same page as what's going on. Really important. When I say the U.S. economy right now, many of you have negative thoughts. Right away, you got negative thoughts. Because what do? You click on MSNBC, you click on Fox, and what do they tell you? They say, hey, the other guys don't know what they're doing. I think this is really important right here. This is long-term real growth in U.S. GDP per capita, real. Inflation-adjusted growth in GDP per capita. Because if we're going to talk about the U.S. economy, we've got to have a measure. We've got to have a measure. What are we trying to do? We're trying to grow the economy. We're trying to make things better, right? We want things to be better for you than it was for your parents and it was for me. That's everybody's goal. Make it better for their children. If you can see this right here, this is a trend line. Growth in real GDP per capita. I see you guys taking notes. Are we going to kick them the slides? Or I was just going to say, I can kick you the slides. Maybe that's not how it's supposed to work in college. I'm going to tell you one other thing about giving this. I don't do this very much at colleges. But I was invited to go down to Mercer College and talk to some of their students and give a lecture, and I did that in February, and they qualified for the NCAA. So I don't know what's going to happen to Elizabethtown next year, but y'all just hang in there. So it could work. I had never been there before, but it'll be big. But look right here. What have we done since before the Civil War? We've grown real U.S. GDP per capita. We've grown the standard of living. And we've grown it at a rather remarkable rate. There's a trend line. Trend lines are stubborn things. You can see every time we come off the trend line, one way or another, what do? We come back to the trend line. And we ought to talk about that more. Because truly, the U.S. economy is a marvel of the world. Can we do things better? Of course we can do things better. Everybody can do things better. But there's no fundamental reason for us to say that the United States economy isn't strong. There's no fundamental reason for us to say it can't be better for you than it was for your parents, than it was for me. No fundamental reason. And we ought to take that very positively as we look forward. And the other thing we ought to do from this is we ought to take some of the naysayers and we ought to say, hey, that's not true, because what do we hear today? This time it's different. This time it's different. We got the wrong guy in the White House. We get the wrong guy in the State House. We get the wrong guy running locally. You honestly don't think in 1865 they all sat around, looked at each other and said, hey, this time it's different. It was different in 1865. You don't think at the end of World War I, they said, hey, this time it's going to be different because this was the war to end all wars. We're not going to have any more wars. 20 years later, we get World War II. They say, wow, this time it's different. On and on. You can look through that whole thing, and yet what have we done in the United States of America? We've grown the standard of living. And we all ought to be very, very positive. Because we've done it by making mistakes, and we've done it by having successes. But we have done it. We want to keep that in mind. The question is why? Because anytime you talk about the economy, you're really going to talk about 3 things. We're going to talk about how do you compete. You're going to talk about that whether the U.S. or whether you're Japan or whether you're France or whether you're China. How do you compete? Second thing you're going to talk about is a little bit the matrices that you see. What are the metrics? what do we see going on? Then the third thing you're going to talk about is what's our collective response. And we tend to talk about what does Washington say, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But why have we been so successful? And I like to call them competitive advantages. Number one, government stability. Not everybody agrees with every decision that they make, but since 1789 we've run the country in the same way. Think through your history courses and think, who else can say that? Not many other countries. Geography. Since 1865, no wars on our soil. What a difference that makes. Not many people in this country wake up every day and say, hey, I wonder who's going to invade today. Doesn't really happen very often, right? All right? Very, very positive for the U.S. economy. Arable land. Not only can we feed ourselves, we can feed a lot of the rest of the world. Think about that. The USDA crop reports just came out, and I know that not one of you read the USDA crop reports, but it looks like, even with the drought in the West, 2014 is going to be a pretty banner year. What are we going to do with those excess agricultural products? We're going to export them to the rest of the world and help people who don't have enough food. Again, very seldom do you wake up and say, I wonder what I'm going to eat today. Raw materials. We have what it takes to make things. Iron ore, lumber, limestone. Yes, we import some things, but we've got a lot of the basic raw materials that it takes to make them, and there aren't many other places in the world that can say that. If we're in Japan, which has been a very successful, and it's a very industrious economy, and I say, hey, tell me about your raw materials. Blank stares. Go to Switzerland. What do they make in Switzerland? They make watches. They make chocolate. Can you grow cocoa in Switzerland? No, really hard to do that. Again, kind of a flip example, but we've got raw materials in this country. Energy costs. Currently, we have the lowest overall energy cost of any nation in the world in the United States of America, and the shale play will be a game changer. One way or another, the shale play will be a game changer. Either we'll get the Keystone Pipeline and other things, or we'll export that. But either way, the production, it's going to be a game changer. Not only are we going to become energy independent in your lifetime, the cost of energy in this country versus the rest of the world is going to continue to come down. Tremendous advantage when we talk about manufacturing. Transportation infrastructure. Most of you can't appreciate that, but our highway system is second to none. And when you're driving through Philadelphia and you get stuck on the Schuylkill, you're saying, well, this isn't second to none, but trust me, it's second to none. Go to India and drive on their transportation system. Go to the UK and drive on theirs. Go to China. Our airports. You can go to Harrisburg International and changing planes one time, you can pretty much get anywhere in the world. Changing planes one time. Our ports. You don't think about that as much here, but if you lived in Norfolk, or you lived in Charleston, you lived in Savannah with what's going on in the Panama Canal, the United States will become the trading center of the world. Our rivers. 60% of all the commercially navigable rivers in the world are in the United States of America, and our railroads. Y'all really don't remember that, but at one point, the Pennsylvania Railroad was the railroad. It was the center of the universe as far as railroad concerns. In the 1970s, the Pennsylvania Railroad went bankrupt. Nobody wanted it. Federal government took it over, created Conrail. Everybody said railroads are going to die. We're going to ship everything by truck. Today, U.S. railroad system is one of the best commercial, not passenger, commercial railroad systems in the world. Education. And you all know this. We could talk K through 12 for a long time, but everybody in the world wants to go to college where? The United States of America. Think about what an advantage that is. Not only can we educate all of y'all, if you were born in this country, but we can educate the best and the brightest from the rest of the world. And if you can do that, if you can attract the best and the brightest from the rest of the world to your colleges and universities, and you can figure out immigration, what can you do? You can keep the best and brightest in your country. A tremendous advantage going forward. And we have a work ethic. And we'll show you some numbers in just a minute. But you will work harder than your parents, and your parents worked harder than your grandparents. And that's not picking on grandma and grandpa, that's a fact. That's a fact. The United States, and the workers in the United States, are the most productive in the world. The German workers, number 2, nobody else is really in third place. And we're able to pass this. We're able to go back, and we can look at U.S. labor productivity. And the graph on the bottom is U.S. GDP per capita. And when we got that and we graphed that, we said, wow, that's pretty good. We really like that. And one of the analysts who looked at me and they said, well, it's just the same graph that you started with. You knew that. What if people just work harder? So the red line on top is real GDP per hour worked. Because if you just work more to produce more, it doesn't work. But look at that. GDP per hour worked is also going up. And we're going to talk about that. And so this is a tremendous story that historically we've been able to grow the standard of living in the United States of America, and we have all these competitive advantages. Now why? Why is this important? Why does this matter? This matters because today we compete in a global economy. Really important. Your whole career will be spent competing in the global economy. And that doesn't mean that all throughout history we didn't import and export things. Of course we did. That's why we're here. Because the Dutch and the British and the French sent colonists over here so they could import things from the parent company and export things back. But today we truly compete in a global economy. And the global economy really was a creation of the United States of America. I'm going to give you a 2-minute history lesson. During the Reagan administration, Ronald Reagan, none of you were born, I'm pretty sure, during the Reagan administration, but Ronald Reagan came up with an idea, and he called it the North American Free Trade Act. And his idea was we would open the borders with Canada, and we would open the borders with Mexico, and we would open them to trade, and we would open them to educational opportunities, and we would open them to immigration. And he tried to get this treaty passed, and he worked on this treaty for the whole 8 years he was there. And when he was done, he handed it off to President Bush the first, not President Bush the second, or potentially President Bush the third, depending on what happens. But anyways, we're back to President Bush the first, and he handed it off to him. And during his administration, Congress passed this. The Senate ratified the treaty. But it didn't get signed until President Clinton became president. But so even right there is sort of an extraordinary thing which we ought to be thinking about. A Republican proposed something, a Republican got it passed, and a Democrat signed it. So right away there you got to think it must have been a pretty good idea if we got those guys to agree. But President Clinton signed it and signed the North American Free Trade Act. And when he signed the North American Free Trade Act, North America accounted for 18% of global GDP. Today, roughly 20 years later, North America accounts for 25% of global GDP. Now, it's not fair, and I can't stand up here and say we grew global GDP from 18 to 25 because we passed NAFTA. But we did pass NAFTA, and it grew from 18 to 25. Sort of hard to isolate the variable if you think about your statistics class. But it happened. It happened. And because of that experiment, we've opened other markets, and we've grown other things. So the United States, the largest economy in the world, is really responsible for the global economy. We really came up with this idea. And this gives us one example that says, hey, if we open borders and we let people do what they do well, we can grow this whole economy. Again, most of you probably didn't pay attention to the IMF summit last week. But the IMF summit, the International Monetary Fund, was all about how do we grow global GDP. Well, one way we grow global GDP is you bring down barriers and you let people compete. Now, let's just think about some other countries that compete right now. China. China 25 years ago, was anybody talking about China? Y'all looking at me going, I don't know, I wasn't alive 25 years ago. But if you were, I promise you nobody was talking about China. Today everybody's talking about China because they become the second largest economy in the world because they chose to do what? Compete. Kind of interesting that a communist nation chose to compete, but that's what they did. They said, we are going to go out and we are going to compete with the rest of the world, and they've grown to be the second largest economy in the world. Now, has that created some challenges in China? For sure it has, and you can see up here, I put massive infrastructure needs and misplaced stimulus. That means they've built a lot of empty buildings and they've got a lot of pollution problems. But they'll work through that because they're going to compete on the world stage and make things happen. And then let's look at Latin America. And Latin America is kind of interesting because if we went back to all those competitive advantages that I went through about the United States in the very beginning, Latin America has a lot of those. They've got a lot of natural resources and they've got a lot of smart people, a lot of things we go through. What haven't they had historically all throughout Latin America? Stable government. So you can kind of see that you need everything. Everything's got to come together. And if everything comes together, then you can grow your GDP. But by far the most interesting is the European Union. Because if we think about the European Union, and we're really talking about Western Europe, and we think about what has happened there in the last 500 years, for the most part, they've been the historical center of commerce and trade. Think about who ran the world. The British ran the world, the French ran the world, the Spanish ran the world, the Dutch ran the world. And if you do that, you kind of start to think to yourself, well, I'm pretty important. You know, things ought to run through here. And when you do that, historically, and this works again, you start to think, well, I don't have to compete. Why would I compete? I'm kind of special. We're sort of special here on our island or in our little country, so we're not going to compete. Who hasn't run the world and who is in Western Europe that does compete? The Germans. The Germans. And this is not a socio-political thing, but it's true. The Germans don't. The Germans compete. The Germans have been very successful. But we've had a lot of problems in Western Europe, right? We've had a lot of problems with what's going on in Greece, Italy, Ireland, Spain, because they've chosen not to compete. And I'm going to use France, and if you're French, I'm going to apologize right now, right in the beginning. But the French basically sat around and they said, you know, what we really want to do is we want to work 32 hours a week. We want to take the whole month of August off, and we'd like to drive big Mercedes. And that's a pretty good plan, right? But in order to do that, they kind of look at that and they say, well, if we only work 32 hours a week, we really can't compete with the rest of the world. So they're getting into economic problems. They've borrowed a lot of money. They've made a lot of mistakes. Greece has done it. Italy's done it. And they'll figure it out. They will figure it out. This isn't forever. But the truth is you've got to get up every day and compete if you want to grow. That's what you've got to do. So with that, that's sort of historical background and how we got there. Let's just take a couple minutes and just look at some metrics on the U.S. economy, what's going on. We've got a pretty good long-term story, something that tells us things would get better. Right here is the S&P 500 and the S&P 500 earnings. S&P 500 is on the top. The S&P 500 is really an index of the global economy. Almost every company that's in the S&P 500, okay, competes globally. We're talking about companies like 3M and Caterpillar and Coca-Cola, Boeing, competing globally. You can see right here at the end of 2009, see if my laser pointer will work. Right here at the end of 2009, stock market started to go up. And it hadn't been a moonshot, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, but the trend line is like this. And stock markets tend to be what? Leading indicators. Leading indicators. They tend to tell us what's going to happen. And the way we know that is right here. You can see the stock market started to go up, but what were corporate profits doing? They were still coming down. So corporations were still figuring out they weren't making more money, but the stock prices started to go up because the markets looked out there and the market said, hey, the global economy is getting better. The global economy is getting better. And even this year, we've set new highs, and everybody's talking about the length and duration of the bull market and all this sort of thing. And I'm not making a comment on what's happening with stock prices per se. I'm making a comment on what's happening with the global economy. This is telling us that things are continuing globally to improve. Very, very important when we think about things going forward. And here we got U.S. consumer confidence and U.S. consumer spending. Just in this country, it's important that the consumer is confident because the consumer makes up 70% of U.S. GDP. So if we want to grow U.S. GDP, you all have to spend more money. You all spend more money when you're confident. Right here you can see, I got two different things. I keep losing my, you can see right here, when the fiscal crisis hit, consumer confidence fell off a cliff, right? Right there, the lowest reading in history since we started measuring it, but it's recovered. It's recovered. It's not back up here to the highs of before the fiscal crisis, but it's recovered. And as that's happened, consumer spending has gotten better. So we get the stock market telling us that the global economy is getting better, and we've got consumer spending telling us that the U.S. economy is getting better. Two pretty positive signs for what's going forward. And then we got manufacturing. And there's a million different things that I could put up here, but I really like to put manufacturing up here. Because if we look at this, and this is industrial production, I promise we wouldn't get into details, but don't worry about it. This is a measure of what we do in this country, and you can see right now, in 2014, we've hit an all-time high. So we're manufacturing and making more in the United States right now than we've ever made. And how can that be? Because we hear all the time, we don't make anything in this country anymore. How can that happen? How can manufacturing be at an all-time high if we don't make anything? Since 1979, we have more than doubled now output in this country. And yet 8 million less people work in manufacturing. 8 million less people work in manufacturing. So, when you see a picture of Detroit and automobile manufacturing, what do you see? I could explain it to you, told me, but the answer is robots. You see robots, right? And that's one of the reasons that we drive productivity, because we invest in plant and we invest in process and we invest in technology. So we're producing more, but we're doing it with less people. We're going to talk about employment in just a minute, and employment is really important. But if you're going to compete, you have to compete in the best manner. And so that's what we've chosen to do. Now, there's a couple other things that's worth looking at here. Not only do we produce the most we've ever produced, we're the largest manufacturing country in the world. By far. We outproduce China by 25%. Largest manufacturing country in the world. Which is interesting when, again, you hear people say all the time we don't produce anything. But what's the most interesting thing about this is since 2010 we've added 500,000 manufacturing jobs in this country. Manufacturing jobs are good jobs. Most of you probably aren't sitting here thinking, I'm going to go in manufacturing. But manufacturing is a good job in the United States of America. And we've added 500,000 manufacturing jobs since 2010. And that is after losing jobs steadily from 1979 to 2010. So for 31 years, we lost jobs steadily. But in the last 4 years, we've added 500,000 jobs. Now, in a country with 146 or 147 million jobs, you could say, what difference does it make? It's the fact that things are starting to turn around, and we'll talk about why in just a minute. Mark Twain, it's attributed to him, history may not repeat itself, but it rhymes. Nothing that we are going through today is truly any different than things we've gone through in the past. There have been conservative administrations, there have been liberal administrations, there have been bubbles burst. It happens. It happens. And the question is, how do we deal with it? So let's just look real quick at what we're dealing with. Then we'll come to a couple conclusions and we'll get your questions. Most of you don't remember this. Almost always when I talk to a group and I look out there, I can say, hey, during most of your career, this was the economy. Some of y'all, you don't know that economy at all. As far as you're concerned, it never happened. But from the end of World War II to 2007, what happened in the U.S. economy? Number one, we had rising asset prices. Everything cost more. And just think about houses. They just went up, right? We had a declining risk premium. People invested aggressively. They took risk with their money. They felt good about what was going on. We saw increased leverage. They borrowed a bunch of money. We'll talk about that in just a minute. That led to strong growth, low unemployment, generally low inflation. I always throw in except with President Ford and President Carter, but most of you have no idea who President Ford and President Carter are, so I won't do that. And aggressive consumer spending. That's what drove the economy. Today, the economy that you're living in, the economy you're going to go into. Number one, we got stabilizing asset prices. Nationwide, from the peak, housing prices are down about 20%. It's a hard number to figure out. But all of you who bought a house and paid $500,000 for it in 2007, it's now worth $400,000 if you're the median person nationwide. Increasing in risk premium. People are tighter with their money. A need for liquidity. Everybody's sitting on a lot of cash. Y'all are sitting around going, I wish I was sitting on a lot of cash. College kids don't really count, but the whole rest of the world's sitting on a lot of cash. And they're reducing their leverage, which means they're paying back debt. That led to limited growth, high unemployment. We're worried to death about deflation. My whole life, nobody's been talking about deflation. All of a sudden, 2009, deflation showed up. What happened if prices don't go up? Whole time since the end of World War II, all we've been worried about is inflation going up too fast, and we're worried about slower consumer spending. I'll skip this real quick, but just we throw this in here. These are all the leading economic indicators. We're able to go back, and I'm not going to go over this whole thing. It's kind of a fascinating slide, but if you go back here, every recession since 1950, 3 years after the start of a recession, what happened to the leading economic indicators? What was the recovery in the U.S. economy? And it's over here on the left graph. And you can see the magnitude that they've recovered. 6 years after the start of the Great Recession, what happened to all the leading economic indicators of recovery? You can see, first of all, that the magnitude is nowhere near as high. And second of all, some of them still haven't recovered. So truly, when somebody gets up and they say to you, hey, even though I went through all this long-term trend line, starting at the beginning, historical GDP, all these really positive reasons, this time it's a little bit different. That shows it's a little bit different. And if we had more time and I thought you all really cared, we'd get in the numbers. That was a joke. You can laugh at that a little bit. But anyways. So what was our response? This is really important. So we get this. This happens over there on the right. That happened. It's fact. But what was our collective response? And this was our collective response. This is total U.S. government outlays as a percent of GDP. And if you just look at that real quick, what did we do? We didn't like the results that were getting in the economy, so we spent a bunch of money in Washington. That's what we did. And there's no right or wrong. You don't have to say we did the right thing or we did the wrong thing. That's what we did. If you go back and you look at this real quick, here's a trend line. It's just above 20% of GDP, going all the way back to 1950. Harry Truman's president, the end of World War II. We spent a little bit over 20% of GDP in Washington. So if GDP is going to be $17 trillion, we spend $3.4 trillion in Washington. The fiscal crisis hits, we're spending right about 20% of GDP, and immediately, bam, we bounce it up to about 25.5. That was our collective response. Again, and it's not a question of, yeah, I think we did the right thing, we did the wrong. That's what we did. We spent a bunch of money in Washington. That's what we said. We don't like the results that we're getting in the economy. We spent a bunch of money. And then you compare it to this. This is receipts at the federal level. This red line. And again, you get a trend line, it's just below 18%. And you can see this going back all the way to 1950 again. We bring in about a little under 18%, which means we borrow about 23%, 2.3%, excuse me, of GDP. And this is interesting because you can't stand up and say, hey, our response is really different because we've been borrowing money forever, going all the way back to 1950. So not only all your lives, pretty much all your parents' lives too, we've been borrowing money. And we've been doing that. But this response was different in that we violated the trend line on the upside, meaning we drove it above this 20.1, and we violated the trend line on the downside. And we never really did that. So what we did is, because we said, hey, these results are so bad and we don't like them, we're going to cut taxes. And we cut taxes, and most of this is the payroll tax. We cut payroll taxes, which doesn't mean a whole lot to y'all. And then we borrowed a bunch of money, and we spent above, and this was called stimulus for the most part. You heard that word bandied about. In the last 5 years, we borrowed and spent about $6.1 trillion. So we borrowed $6.1 trillion. Now, why is this different? What is different this time? This is not a political thing. Again, which way you want to go. What's different is we violated the trend line on the bottom and the top. And depending on whether you wave the red flag or the blue flag, pretty much everybody says that's non-sustainable. The big discussion is how you're going to get one of those lines back within the trend range. Okay? If you support the current administration, they want to do what? Raise taxes to get this bottom line back in here. If you want to change the administration, they want to cut spending and bring this line down. Now, the interesting thing about it is, even with all the angst and carrying on we have in Washington, those lines are coming toward the trend. When 2014 is down, this line on the bottom may actually get up here and be within the trend range again if we look at some of the numbers that we're seeing. It looks like we're going to close the budget deficit to less than $500 billion. And that is real money. To say less than $500 billion and not shriek is tough. But when you've been running over $1 trillion, we're making some progress. But the economy's growing. The payroll tax is back in. There's some taxes with the Affordable Care Act. And we may get this bottom line here. And then the second thing which is happening is spending is coming down. A lot of that is a result of what we call sequestration and other things that are going on. But again, we're coming back toward those trend lines. And if you think back to the very beginning, I told you the trends are stubborn things. They don't get violated very easy. So it's interesting how we're coming back to these trends again. This is just something, if you're interested, one of the things that we see, and one of the things that we heard in the State of the Union, is the president said, we've got to take these shackles off so we can start spending money again. That's going to get the economy going. Meaning he didn't like sequestration. That's a way for him to, he's allowed to say that. But if you look up here, you can see the 5 years of the current administration is the highest spending in history. It just ties back in again to the graph before. Now, I'm not making a political statement. We can do that in the Q&A if you want, but that is what happened. We spent more money the last 5 years than we've ever spent before. Now, really interesting. A couple things, those of you taking notes, that you should remember. Number one is you should remember the GDP per capita. You should remember the positive story. That's really big. Second thing is you should remember what our response was. But this is the third thing that you should remember. And this is really, really interesting when you think about the U.S. economy. What I just went over with the government was our collective response to the fiscal crisis. Right? That's what we did. It hit, we got those numbers, we borrowed money, and we spent it. What did we do individually? Exactly the opposite. This is U.S. household debt as a percent of GDP. So this is how much money collectively we have all borrowed. And you can see over here in 2007, we got ourselves almost to 100% of GDP. The fiscal crisis hits, the Great Recession, whatever we want to call it. Individually, we don't feel confident. What do we start doing? Paying back debt. So at the same time we're borrowing money collectively in Washington, individually we're paying back debt. Absolutely counter. Absolutely counter to what went on. And these numbers lag quite a bit. But by the time we get these numbers through 2013, we're going to have paid back about $4+ trillion worth of debt. So we borrowed $6 trillion in Washington, and individually we paid $6 trillion back. So when you say to yourself, I wonder why the numbers didn't get better, there's your answer. Because we ran it counter purposes. And if we go back all the way here to the Great Depression, we see that the exact same thing happened in 1929. And most of you haven't read a whole lot of books on FDR and his administration, but they had a lot of the same plans that the current administration has. Created jobs, spent money. But at the same time they were doing that, what were individuals doing? Paying back debt. Paying back debt. And we could spend hours on this chart, but we don't have hours to pay on this chart. But it's interesting because if you think to yourself, if you just start from scratch and you say, hey, we're going to borrow and spend $6 trillion in Washington, most people would come to the assumption the economy is going to be pretty good. But yet it hasn't been. It's better, but it hasn't been great. And here's the reason. All right, just a couple more trends. We'll come to some conclusions. We'll get to your questions. This is employment. And employment's sort of interesting, and you'll notice that I'm talking about employment. Unemployment, the numbers are so hard to measure. Politicians like to use unemployment because they like to drive unemployment down. I get it. We want more people. But really what we need is employment. And if you look here real quick, you can see from the end of World War II, okay, had a little under 60 million jobs. And in just about 65 years, we drove it to about 145 jobs, 45 million jobs. A tremendous, tremendous track record. And almost at no time did we have less jobs than the year before, except right over here. From 2008 to 2009, we lost 9 million jobs in this country. That had never happened post-World War II. Nobody had a plan that said we're going to lose 9 million jobs. Nobody. Elizabethtown College didn't sit around and say, hey, we got all these prospective students, but one of every 14 parents who's going to send those prospective students is going to lose their jobs. But that's what happened. That had never happened. Now, since 2009, last 5 years, we've worked like crazy. And the truth is, civilian jobs, private sector jobs, all-time high. We got all those jobs back. Government jobs are still down, so we haven't gotten all the jobs back, but we've gotten those jobs back, and that's really positive. It's one of the things which is fueling the economy. Because those people who are now working are what? Consumer confident, spend a little bit of money, paying some taxes. Really important to what's going on over here. But the job's not over. Because if you look at this trend line, and right now we're at about 145, 146 million jobs, but if you look here, you can see that that trend line told us we were going to be up here at 153 or 154 million jobs. So we still got work to do. Because the whole system is built on what? More people working. More people working. The way we're going to pay back things, more people working, the economy is going to grow. Very important as we look forward. All right. There's a graph that I threw in here, and I spent a whole lot of time with the first class on what happened with the housing market. So good news is I'm not going to beat the housing market to death. That's on the right. We know we had a bubble, it happened. But But one of the interesting things is, we went through after this happened and we said to ourselves, should we have known that the housing market was in a bubble? Because I told the group this morning, I said, one of the problems with bubbles is when they're going on, they feel great. You know, you just feel wonderful. Building more houses, prices are going up, this is wonderful. Should we have been able to predict it? And we went over here and we looked at real U.S. median household income, and you can see for the last 25 years, real, inflation adjusted, median, right in the middle, U.S. household income has done what? Nothing. Nothing. Hasn't moved in 25 years. And if you remember back to the debates, President Obama, candidate Romney said to President Obama, real U.S. median household income hasn't gone up during your administration. And if President Obama would have come to this talk, he could have said, it hasn't gone up in 25 years. He hadn't come to this talk, so he didn't have that fact, but it hasn't. Okay? So he missed that. And so we looked at that and we said, you know, we should have known. If people weren't making more money, they couldn't afford more house. Absent financing schemes and interest rates coming down, the house you can afford is the house you can afford. If you make $50,000 a year and you can afford a $100,000 house, 25 years later you make $50,000 a year, how much house can you afford? Same house. So we felt kind of good about that. But the real question was, why has that not gone up in 25 years? And this is a big deal. This is a big deal we're talking about, because you get income disparity and the rich are getting richer and the other people aren't. But the first thing you got to say to yourself is why? Why didn't that happen? And I'm going to tell you a quick story, and you guys won't get the story, so I'll tell you the punchline. But it's 1975, and you are anywhere in the world, and you need to buy a steel I-beam, great big piece of steel. You're going to build a bridge or a great big building, you've got to call where? Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, because that's where they make steel I-beams. In 1975, the rest of the world is still recovering from World War II. 30 years later, you guys are going, you've got to be kidding me, but you still are. They're not making steel in Korea. They're not making cars in Japan. Western Europe still recovering. So if you want to buy a big piece of steel, you call Bethlehem Steel. How long do you think it takes before Bethlehem Steel figures out they can charge anything they want for that piece of steel? Not very long. How far do you think the workers are behind Bethlehem Steel and thinking they can charge anything they want for their labor? Not very long. Fast forward, 1980. You want to buy a car. You buy any car you want as long as it's made in Detroit. Same story. Prices go up, wages go up. All of a sudden, 1985, you're standing on the street corner, zoom. Car goes by, you look at your buddy, you say, what was that? Buddy says, it's a Datsun. You say, what's a Datsun? Okay? Datsun didn't make it, but Datsun became Nissan, right? All of a sudden, you can buy cars that are made in Japan. You can buy cars that are made in Korea. You can buy cars that are made in Europe. What happens to prices? Price competition, they compress. What happens to wages? Wages compress. What that right there is wage rationalization. That is what happened. In 1975, the U.S. worker got paid more than the rest of the world, and got paid more than the rest of the world by a lot. Today, the median U.S. worker gets paid more than the rest of the world, but the amount that they're ahead has shrunk rapidly. The U.S. workers should get paid more because they're the most productive worker in the world. It should work that way. But this is the answer to where there's 500,000 manufacturing jobs came from, which are so important. And that's why more manufacturing jobs are going to come back. Because all of a sudden, after 25 years of rationalizing wages, the U.S. worker is very competitive. Boeing decides they're going to make the Dreamliner in South Carolina because wage rates are competitive. Rolls-Royce decides they're going to make turbofans in Prince George's County, Virginia because wage rates are competitive. Honda decides they're going to increase manufacturing, car building in the United States of America because wage rates are competitive. Very, very important going forward. All right, we're going to come to a couple conclusions. Get your questions and go. Teddy Roosevelt said, any more decision, the best thing you can do is the right thing. The worst thing you can do is nothing. I know for a fact that none of you are thinking to yourself, I need another book to read. But this summer, go down to Barnes & Noble, the library, and get a book called The Bully Pulpit by Doris Kearns Goodwin that is about Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. And read this book. And it's a long book. You're going to get this book and think, that guy's nuts. I don't want to read this book. I promise you the parallels and the things you'll see to what's going on in your life, you'll really appreciate. So what do we have to do with the federal government? We've got to make some decisions. For those of you here this morning, we talked about the government's role in housing. We talked about the fact that Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, and FHA have all done what in the last 5 years? Gone bankrupt. From a societal standpoint, we can argue they do good. From an economic standpoint, not so much. Healthcare. Y'all are seeing the debate about what's going on in healthcare, and I'm not going to get up and lecture you on the pros and cons of Obamacare. But even before Obamacare, we spend more on healthcare in this country than any other developed nation in the world. We're number one in healthcare spending. Our results aren't even close to the top. That does not mean that government healthcare can't work. It means that to date it hasn't worked in this country. Education. We talked about student loans. If you weren't there, it was a fascinating discussion about what was happening in the student loan market, the regulatory climate. Do y'all spend much time thinking about the regulatory climate in your life? What happens? No, you don't. But I want to tell you about the regulatory climate for just a minute, because in its basest form, regulations are what? A tax. A tax. They may be a tax we want to pay. In 1970, we decided as a nation we wanted to clean up the air and water in this country, and we've done it. Remarkably cleaner today than it was almost 50 years ago. But we paid to do that. We all paid to do that. But when you look at all these regulations, one of the things they do is they make you less competitive globally. You can't have regulations different than the rest of the world. And we've got to figure out what we're going to do with interest rates. You kept interest rates at zero, right? Does everybody know why we've kept interest rates at zero? The word out of Washington is always to help the banks. Does 0% interest rates help the banks? Absolutely not. You'll notice that the banks all do better when interest rates go up. Zero interest rates help whom? The largest debtor in the history of the world, the United States government. They're $17 trillion in debt. They want to pay the lowest interest rates that they can, which makes some sense. Companies, organizations, I'm going to skip through real quick. Sir John Harvey Jones said the nicest thing about not planning is fair comes a complete surprise rather than being preceded by a period of worry and depression. I throw that in because everybody in the world laughs except college kids, because first of all, it's funny. But what it really means is you're going to have to spend some time in your life thinking about the things that we're about to talk about. These are going to be important. It's your generation who's going to make these decisions. My generation left it to you. No matter what we do, you are going to be $17 trillion worth of debt. We did that. Nothing we can do, but you're going to decide what you're going to do forward. Number one, we have to have tax code reform in this country. Y'all don't really spend a lot of time on it, but the tax code in this country is out of control. We have laws that said if Coca-Cola wants to build a new plant in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania, and employ 500 people, and they want to bring the money that they make selling Coke in India to this country to build that plant, they have to pay taxes. Now, they already paid taxes in India because that's where they sold the Cokes and made the money. But we got a law that says if they bring that money back here, they got to pay taxes. Do you think that Coca-Cola is going to bring that money back here and build a plant in Elizabethtown? Or do you think they're going to build that plant in India? Not that hard to figure out what they're going to do. All kinds of rules like that in the tax code that we have to figure out. If we had more time, we could spend forever talking about it. After a regulatory overhaul, I've beaten on this pretty good, but what is the government's role going to be? What is the government's role going to be? Most of you didn't pay attention to this, but in the State of the Union, the President said he wanted to fast-track several trade agreements. Anybody watch the State of the Union? Remember that? Well, he did. Trust me, he did. The next day, Harry Reid. Everybody know who Harry Reid is? Harry Reid's his right-hand man, runs the Senate. Harry Reid came out and said, hey, not so fast on those fast-track agreements. Why? Because those fast-track agreements were going to impinge on the people of Nevada who elect him. But the truth is, if we're going to go global and compete, we've got to go global and compete. We can't just say, well, we're not going to help people in Pennsylvania and Ohio because, oh, that might impinge on the people of Nevada. We really have to open up, and we've got to compete, and we have to have fiscal responsibility. And I'm going to tell you a quick story, and then we're going to get to questions. This is a true story. In November, we, the United States of America, launched the USS Gerald Ford. The USS Gerald Ford is a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, and by all measures, it's the most sophisticated piece of weaponry in the history of the world. It is also the most expensive piece of weaponry in the history of the world. It employs hundreds of thousands of people to build these aircraft carriers. But we launched this aircraft carrier, and what do we do with the U.S. nuclear-powered Navy? What does it do? It sails around the world and promotes peace. That's what it does. Now, you may say it does it in a bullying manner, but still, that's what it does. And even if you watch a television commercial, U.S. Navy, a force for good. That's what they do. They sail around the world. And if you've ever seen one of those aircraft carriers up close, I promise you will say to yourself, I don't want to mess with that. Okay? But that's what they do. They sail around the world to promote peace. Same week, the announcement came out that 1 out of every 7 people in this country is on food assistance. 1 out of every 7 people is on food assistance. So if we have 70 people in this room and we represent the United States of America, 10 of you are on food assistance. You walk down the street past 6 other people. 1 of those 6 people is on food assistance. Now, real easy to say, we got to quit building aircraft carriers. They cost too much. Real easy to say, we got to get those people off food assistance. This is guns and butter. Econ 201. I don't know what you call it here. The University of Virginia was Econ 201s, where we learned about guns and butter. But that's exactly what this is, right? But they're hard choices. Because if you've never been hungry, you don't know what it's like to be hungry. It's easy to say, let's get those people off food assistance. The other thing it's easy to say, hey, let's cut the defense budget. When is the last time we had a real dollar inflation-adjusted cut in the defense budget? 1935. You don't remember what happened after 1935. We had World War II. I'm not saying cut the defense budget, got World War II, but it's a big deal to make these kind of. But you have to do it. You're going to have fiscal responsibility. You can't do both. In this country, we can do anything. We cannot do everything. Albert Einstein said we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. You'll notice when I talked in the very beginning about competitive advantage, I didn't talk about innovation. Almost every great idea of the 20th century came from where? The US of A. And it didn't come from the US of A because we're necessarily smarter. It came from the US of A because we promote innovation. We promote innovation in our educational systems. We promote education in our colleges, our universities. And when people innovate, we reward them. If you've read Steve Jobs' book, he says in that book 50 times, he didn't invent the Apple, the Mac. Does anybody not have? No, I don't say in the whole room. We all have them, right? But he didn't invent that to get rich. He invented that because he wanted to change the way we did things. But when he did invent it, what happened? He got rich. It just happened. So we reward innovation in this country, which is a tremendous positive advantage for us. We're going to have to compromise. Again, y'all don't follow this, but if you follow it at all, the Murray-Ryan spending bill, which is the omnibus spending bill that we run this country on right now, Representative Ryan is pretty far to the right, Representative Murray is pretty far to the left, but they actually got together and passed a bill. And that's almost a landmark achievement because for the 5 years prior to that, we didn't have a bill. We didn't have a single bill. Okay? We did it all with continuing amendments is how we did it. So we're starting to compromise. And that's the way you start to get things done in this country. We've got to have clearly defined objectives. You don't remember it at all, but this is the 50th year of the war on poverty. President Johnson, who was the president when I was a little boy, he declared war on poverty. And he said he was going to wipe out poverty in the United States of America. In the last 50 years, we've spent $20.7 trillion on poverty. In 1964, 15% of the country lived in poverty. Today, 15% of the country lives in poverty. I'm not standing up there and telling you that we didn't help some people with that $20.7 trillion. We absolutely did. But if the goal was to wipe out poverty, we spent $20.7 trillion, didn't get anywhere. We get the same thing. So we have to have clearly defined objectives. They're very important. We've got to get it right the first time. If we had more time, we could talk about why we are not Japan, why we are not Greece, why we are not Italy, and we're not. But when you're $17 trillion in debt, you've got to make the right decisions. The President said in his State of the Union he wanted to spend $350 billion on roads, and it sounds like a lot of money, but it's not. The only problem is we don't have $350 billion because we're $17 trillion in debt, and we've got to focus on growth and competing because nothing else is relevant. If you go all the way back to the original slide, how did we make it better for everybody? And we could prove this. This just isn't talk. Everybody's life has gotten better since 1860. Whether you were the top of the economic pyramid or the bottom of the economic pyramid, everybody's better off today than they were in 1860. Now, I'm not telling you that the people on the top aren't more better off, if that's proper English, than the people on the bottom. But everybody got better because we grew and we competed. Harry Truman said men and women make history and not the other way around in periods where there's no leadership. society stands still. Progress occurs when courageous, skillful leaders seize the opportunity to change things. And then he said for the better, because he was talking about himself and he wanted us to know that he'd done a good job. It's hard today to be a leader. Really hard today to be a leader. And that is one thing that has changed. If I stood here today and that camera was tied into Fox and tied into MSNBC, and I said, I love Elizabethtown College. This place is great. And they picked that up, and 5 minutes from now, and that's about how long the news cycle was, that was on MSNBC. Jung loves Elizabethtown College. Somebody from Fox would run a story that says he hates Muhlenberg, or whatever your biggest rival is. I don't know what it is. But that's the way the world works, right? If you're going to go one way, you got to have the other side. So if I got up here and the press was in here, depending on which way they leaned, left or right, one person would say he wants to build more aircraft carriers and get rid of feeding the poor. The other people would say he wants to build the poor and cut on defense. It's hard to be a leader today, but this is what it takes. This is why compromise is so important, so we get people together. But the bottom line is, and I hope you got this, 3 things. Number 1, we've got an unbelievable and the envy of the world track record with our economy. None of you should be sitting in your seats saying, I don't have a chance to grow. I don't have a chance to thrive. You absolutely do. Number 2, we've got some metrics which tell us that things are getting better. Really, by this time next year, we're going to have employed more people in this country than at any other time in history. We still got to get better, but we're getting better, and you ought to feel good about that. But then number 3, we've got some tough decisions to make. These are real decisions, and we're going to have to do it. All right, I left 7 minutes for questions at the very most, because I know you got to get here for lunch. Who's got a thought, a comment? I just got up here and did a song and dance for 44 minutes, and you guys don't have a single comment.
Talk a little bit about stocks and bubbles in general. Do you have any comments or opinions on the tech stock IPO bubble that a lot of people are talking about?
I'm going to give you a smart answer, and I'm going to give you a real answer. You know, Casey Stengel said never make predictions, especially about the future, you know, because if you do that, you're going to be wrong. Everything goes in cycles. Everything goes in cycles. And when you start to get a growth rate which violates the trend, it almost always tells you that it's going to come back. The question is when it's going to come back. You know, when gold was at $1,600 an ounce, it was really easy to say gold's in a bubble. But then gold went to $1,850 an ounce. So if you told somebody to sell, you left $250 on the table. Well, then it went right back down to $1,600. Same thing's going to happen. Right now, there's a lot of money on the sidelines and a lot of demand. If you bought, I don't care, whatever, you know, Facebook right now, you know, with Facebook probably going to come back to the median and then maybe go back? Yes. So yeah, we're a little bit above the growth line right now, but probably it's going to have a correction, if that makes any sense. Anybody else? Really appreciate you having me. Have a good lunch and have a good day.